So I would like to share our report, the results and the recommendations of the report that UN Women had issued in 2018, which looked at the specific intersection of the YPS and WPS agenda. And I was saying that this report provided a useful framework for partnering with and investing in young people to prevent violence, to promote their inclusion, and to translate the demographic dividend into a peace dividend, offering a detailed strategy for the implementation of the YPS agenda. The report essentially looked at three mutually reinforcing tactics. First, investing in young people's capacities, as you have, Jessica, stressed, on funding. It also looked at agency and leadership of young people through substantial funding support, network building, and capacity strengthening. Secondly, it looked at transforming the systems that reinforced exclusion in order to address structural barriers to youth participation. And third, it looked at prioritizing partnerships and collaborative action where young people are viewed as equal and essential partners for peace. And just very quickly on partnerships, as you may know, UN Women had launched, for example, a global program that's called the Generation Equality Initiative or Generation Equality Forum that was that had a very specific. The program itself is a multi-stakeholder partnership that looks at linking government entities together with the private sector, international, regional organizations, civil society, as well as academics. And that specific partnership has a focus on promoting leadership of young people, young women specifically. And I could tell more about that in the discussion if that is of interest. But reflecting on nearly 20 years of implementation efforts of the WPS agenda will be useful to the YPS agenda. And here are some three big buckets of cross-cutting recommendations I would like to highlight. First, the intersectional and divergent identities that differentiate the lived experiences of young people in conflict call for a nuanced and inclusive implementation of the YPS programs. The term, as you know, young people should be understood as both young women and young men equally and be context-specific and reflective of the different experiences of young people beyond gender and age groups. The two agendas, WPS and YPS, are inextricably linked as they share core commitments to prevention, participation, and protection. Despite important policy intersections and strategic value in partnerships, we need to resist the tendency to lump together women and youth. But expand on the relationship between gender and youth would be essential, rather than blurring women and youth as one category. The value in this relationship resides in ensuring that the YPS agenda is gendered, and conversely, the WPS agenda is more attuned to age and generational differences. The second bucket of recommendations in this report looked at monitoring progress on implementation. The complementary goals of the YPS and WPS, as well as the Sustainable Development Agendas, ask for the establishment of strong, well-defined, and measurable indicators. Some of the indicators used to track and report on Resolution 1325 and the SDGs, for example, could be adapted. And one mechanism, as we know, is the development of national action plans by member states, UN member states. There are a number of these already. There's a whole network on the WPS on 1325. And there are also NAPs, National Action Plans, that are being developed on YPS in the past few years. The third bucket of recommendation looks at the relative shortage of information on young people as active peace builders, and therefore calls for the establishment of an online collection of research data, good practices, and case studies on the role of young women in the peace building process. In order to support the implementation of the YPS agenda, we need to ensure that the right investments in youth are made. and their peace-building work is recognized and nurtured, and most importantly, backed by political will and funding, which is the crux of the discussion today. UN Women has invested in young women emerging as peace builders at different decision-making levels. UN Women organized a capacity building event, for example, for 54 young women from Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq to help increase their impact on peace negotiations and the implementation of peace agreements. UN Women recently launched also a series of policy briefs on COVID-19 response, including one on women's participation in ceasefires that was done jointly with UNDPPA. We've looked at, there's a publication on young women peace builders and the impact of the COVID-19 to their advocacy. And UN Women also supports young women's participation, protection, and access to funding and programs. For example, in Colombia, UN Women trained about 100 women and young victims of sexual violence and forced disappearance, which strengthened their knowledge of transitional justice in the national and international framework and the integral system on truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition for the implementation of the peace agreement. So I will stop there. If there are maybe more questions specifically on generation equality as well, and how UN Women has worked with regards to building partnerships and the impact of those, I'm happy to elaborate more, but giving the space now for other colleagues on the panel. Thank you, Jessica. Over to you.
Thank you, Leah. So now we're going from UN Women to the Global Network of Women Peace Builders. So our next presenter is Shauna Crystal, and she's the Resource Mobilization and Communication Specialist, and she's going to talk about how the Women Peace and Youth Peace and Security agendas can utilize CEDAW as a way to synergize. Over to you, Shauna.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you, Jessica, again, and the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers for organizing this important discussion. Once again, my name is Shauna Crystal, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak today on behalf of the Global Network of Women Peace Builders. There is an ever-growing need to develop coherent and cohesive structures for advocating, financing, implementing, and monitoring the women peace and security and youth peace and security agendas. And as Jessica said, today I will be specifically discussing the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women as a practical example of a framework to help bridge gaps and leverage some of those synergies. CEDAW, adopted in 1979, 21 years before the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, elevated gender equality in international law and continues today to provide a comprehensive framework for non-discrimination and equality between women and men. So through the CEDAW committee, which oversees the reporting and implementation of the convention, it's also one of the most flexible human rights treaties and allows for the adaptation and development of policy recommendations that respond to evolving global realities, including at the intersections of WPS and YPS. Within the WPS and YPS agendas, there is a strong emphasis on several overlapping themes, such as discrimination faced by young women as both women and young people, the exclusion of women and youth from meaningful participation, and the role of women and youth in conflict prevention, response, and recovery. However, a significant challenge in implementing both agendas is the lack of universal and mandatory reporting. This also manifests in differing approaches to implementation. For example, the development of national action plans versus coalitions to integrate WPS or YPS into existing policies. In this context, CEDAW offers an opportunity for member states and civil society to leverage an existing reporting mechanism to report on the implementation of WPS and YPS, but also to monitor their application. So to emphasize this, I'd like to share the examples of several general recommendations, specifically General Recommendations 30 and 36, which provide some insights into how CEDAW can be effectively leveraged to support WPS and YPS. In General Recommendation 30 on women in conflict prevention, conflict, and post-conflict situations adopted in 2013, the CEDAW committee established clear linkages between CEDAW and the Women, Peace, and Security resolutions. This included by highlighting key measures to effectively implement CEDAW in conflict prevention, conflict, and post-conflict settings, emphasizing obligations to ensure women's protection and meaningful participation, as well as by recommending that states parties align strategies and national action plans on WPS with the convention, and that adequate budgets are allocated for their implementation. This recommendation effectively created a framework for complementary reporting on CEDAW and WPS implementation, urging states parties to monitor and remain accountable for this synergy in future reports to the CEDAW committee. A similar opportunity for integrating synergies with YPS was presented in the 2017 General Recommendation 36 on the right of women and girls to education. This recommendation acknowledges the disproportionate impact of conflict and violence on women and girls, urges their meaningful participation in conflict prevention and peace building, and offers guidance for ensuring safe and equitable access to education, even during armed conflict and natural disasters. Although the recommendation is not specific to young women or young people as a distinct category, its priorities are closely intertwined with those of the YPS agenda and several of its pillars. As such, General Recommendation 36, like General Recommendation 30, opens a door for the use of CEDAW as a tool for encouraging and monitoring progress in YPS implementation. These examples demonstrate some of the concrete ways that CEDAW can be leveraged to strengthen and reinforce synergies between WPS and YPS, particularly by establishing frameworks for contextualizing, implementing, and reporting on the agendas. Moreover, CEDAW general recommendations and reports not only provide guidance to member states on how to improve and track synergistic implementation of the WPS and YPS agendas, but the CEDAW framework also serves as a critical mechanism for civil society to ensure accountability through shadow reports, joint advocacy, partnerships, and more. For more than 7 years, the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, along with other civil society partners, has been developing practical resources, including case studies, workshops, and guides to support the integration of WPS and YPS in CEDAW shadow reports and to bolster the capacity of civil society organizations, government agencies, and other practitioners to advocate CEDAW, WPS, and YPS synergies. Please see the link. I encourage everyone to look at the link that Jessica shared in the chat, and I will send it again to learn more about GNWP's training manual on how to effectively strengthen the synergies between women, peace and security and youth peace and security and CEDAW. The women, peace and security and youth peace and security agendas, as has been said, are inextricably linked and mutually reinforcing. Frameworks such as CEDAW create opportunities to harness those synergies and ensure that the how-to of comprehensive implementation is accessible to member states and civil society alike. Sustainable and inclusive peace, as we know, can only be achieved through the intentional and meaningful integration of the unique needs of women and youth in all aspects of peace building and conflict prevention, response, and recovery. Thank you so much, and I look forward to an enriching discussion.
Thank you, Shauna. And just to highlight the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, they've done a lot of work looking at the synergies between the W and YPS agendas, and including another resource that I'll put in the chat about connecting the two agendas to the Beijing 25 and Generation Equality Forum. So there is an advocacy paper there that gives another idea for a modality to synergize that you can also ask about in the Q&A. But now I will turn it to Erica Yeag, who is a fellow at the Center for Justice at Queensland University of Technology, and she was the lead writer for the Interagency Standing Committee's Youth Guidelines. And she's going to talk about that today and how that built on the original guidelines that were developed in the humanitarian space. So I turn it to you, Erica.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and everyone for having me as part of this meeting. I'll be sharing more about the IES Youth Guidelines, as well as how you could see its interlinkages between the Women, Peace and Security and the Youth, Peace and Security. So I'd like to start by sharing a little bit more of how the guidelines was put together. Like first, it was really embedded through the principle of humanitarian peace building and development nexus. So it focuses more on the coherent and systematic approach in responding to emergencies and also it focuses on the work that needed to address people's vulnerabilities before, during, and after crisis. So it's actually seen by young people as an opportunity to enhance, for instance, gender justice and inclusion, especially for the long-term support for women's and young people's organization and ensuring that youth and women's rights are integral to both the immediate responses and the long-term outcomes. So the tool that I'm about to share is an example of the integration of this nexus. At the same time, it highlights the principle that is both embedded in the WPS and YPS through its intersectional approach to humanitarian response, such that a lot of young people have raised that some emergency situations are also entry points for peace-building initiatives and vice versa. So the ones that really put this IAS youth guidelines together is called the Compact for Young People in Humanitarian Action. So this was actually launched in the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit that is currently led by IFRC and UNFPA and brings together 60 like-minded humanitarian partners, including governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and youth-led groups. So collectively, the Compact agreed on 5 key principles. First is service delivery, which focuses more to promote the increase in age and gender responsive inclusive programs. Second is on participation, is focused a lot more on the systematic inclusion, engagement, and partnership with young people in all phases of humanitarian action, including in decision-making processes at all levels and budget allocation. Third is focused more on the capacity side, which builds and strengthens young people's capacities and capabilities to be effective humanitarian actors. And the fourth one is resources, again, reiterating the support of the needs and priorities of young people, especially having flexibility in kind of giving funding to young people. And finally, data. Often data regarding young people is not really seen. So this part is really focused on the generation and use of age, gender, sex disaggregated data pertaining to adolescents and youth in humanitarian settings. So why the IESC Youth Guidelines? So first, the guidelines is formed and put together in order to support humanitarian actors in UN agencies, INGOs, and even young people on how to work effectively with and for young people in humanitarian and protective crisis. So who is the target audience of these guidelines? So it's intended for humanitarian aid staff at the country level, including youth-led groups and youth-led organizations. And what is this document? So later I'll share more about what the content of this document is, but it's really to make sure that we don't forget about young people's needs and priorities, as young people are often overlooked when it comes to humanitarian response. So these guidelines help responders to recognize the crucial and significant role of young people to make sure that humanitarian response is more inclusive and relevant for them. So how did these guidelines come to be? It wasn't just a lot of writers writing in one room, but there was really a lot of consultation that happened. We ensured that there is gender balance in field consultation that happened in 2 years, 2018 to 2019, reaching 500 crisis-affected youth, but also humanitarian actors in 20 countries. So this is how the guidelines came to be. So as I mentioned, I'd like to share a little bit more of what's inside the guidelines. So there are 5 sections to it. The first part focuses on making the case as to why we need to work with and for young people. Second part is focused more on the key principles that should underpin work with and for young people. The third part unpacks and gives the conceptual definition of meaningful participation and highlights the strategic areas for ensuring participation. The fourth section, Section D, is how young people can be involved and engaged across the different phases of the humanitarian program cycle. And Section E is specific tip sheets for how to implement adolescent and youth responsive program in each of the different sectors. And actually in section E, which I'll show more in detail later, there is a specific part on peace building where it talks about how we work with young people in the peace building aspect, in peace building context. It's really clear, like in the humanitarian program coordination, there is no peace building coordination group. However, in these guidelines, young people really pushed to have a peace building sector or a peace building tip sheet, because these are areas in which they work in. And in addition to the peace building, they also have really suggested to have a disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation tip sheet. Later, you'll see more of how it looks like. So these guidelines help practitioners to make the case to why it's important to work with young people. So we have a few tips in terms of how you could advocate in terms of working with and for young people. First is really highlight young people's rights to appropriate services and meaningful participation. Second is more of realizing that adolescence and youth is a key life stage, because while often overlooked, adolescence and youth is actually the second window of opportunity for nurturing rapid learning and brain development. And it also focuses more on how young people have their specific needs, and working with them is one way in terms of generating that kind of support in order to be able to address their needs and priorities in terms of crisis and disasters. So how do we make the case for working with and for young people? So 4 quick points. First, the fundamental right. We have a lot of normative frameworks and guide on why we need to work with young people. First is the CRC, or the Convention on the Rights of Children. We also have CEDA, which was mentioned earlier, which talks about young people's participation, or the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction also talks about how young people's participation is important, and even the UN Human Rights Council resolution on the right to education. The second point is young people, it's a key stage of life that's often overlooked and seldom acknowledged, which talks more about the exclusion and widespread among young women and young men across the globe, even outside the humanitarian emergency space. So that's why it's really important to kind of put them front and center in the programs that we're doing. Third is the differentiated needs, and it varies across the different ethnic identity, disability, and other characteristics related to diversity and context. And this is actually one part that you can see on the intersectionality between the WPS and YPS and how they are working together. And finally, adolescent girls and young women, even outside the context of humanitarian crisis, the starting point for girls and young women is far behind that of their counterpart male peers. So this is actually the main 4 key points of how we make the case that is included in these guidelines. The next part, I just wanted to show you, I won't go in detail, but this is the humanitarian program cycle, which provides the different phases of how we could really integrate young people within the cycle. As you can see, young people are not only in the needs assessment or in the evaluation, but we can see it's possible to really integrate young people in the different phases of the program cycle. I won't go deep into this part, but you can have a look at the guidelines where you can see how it's possible to integrate young people throughout this cycle. And then we also have the key program approaches, which is also included in the guidelines. One thing that I really like to focus here is the gender target and gender transformation component, which actually is being spelled like really detailed in the IS Youth Guidelines, wherein we not only look at, like, for young people that have used these guidelines and that have used it in the field, they've also looked at something that's broader than women, like the LGBT community and others. And they've really used it in a way in such that they would be able to respond to their needs. For instance, in the recent COVID-19 response where they used the guidelines, they've done an assessment of what are the needs of young key populations, for instance, when it comes to the COVID-19, for instance, their access to PrEP, their access to HIV testing and whatnot. And then another thing here is the The partnerships with youth organizations is really important. Not only those that are established larger youth organizations, but working with local youth community organizations is really important to prioritize. And then again, we see here the working across the humanitarian development and peace nexus. I mentioned earlier about the tip sheets. So there are specific tips for each coordination mechanisms for humanitarian response. And I mentioned about the 2 additional ones that's included in these guidelines that young people really pushed for, the DRR, NCCA, and the sustaining peace. I'd like to show you an example of what the tip sheet looks like. So this is just a few snapshots of what it looks like inside the guidelines. So this is the sustaining peace tip sheet, where it talks about the HPC phases or the humanitarian program cycle phase, what to do, and tips for young people's participation. So we have the needs assessment, strategic planning, resource mobilization, implementation monitoring, and operational peer review and evaluation. So with these guidelines, we also have the facilitator's guide, which includes session presentation and templates. So those that are working in Afghanistan, it's also now available in Dari and Pashto. So I guess we'll have more questions and more time later in case there's anything specific within the guidelines that you have questions on. So handing it back to you, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. And we have one last speaker before we go to Q&A. So we've heard a lot about participation and protection synergies between the WPS and YPS agendas. So now we can hear more about the synergies in the prevention space. So I will turn it to Marina Kumskova, who is the co-facilitator of the Civil Society UN Prevention Platform.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jessica, for organizing the discussion. Thank you all of the participants for listening, and I hope I would be able to build on these amazing presentations that have been done before me. My name is Marina Kumskova. I'm UN liaison with GPAC, but also co-facilitator of the Civil Society UN Prevention Platform with Quaker UN office. And in our presentation today, what we were trying to focus is on the policy overview, to look at the opportunities to implement and strengthen specifically financing of the YPS agenda. I think it has been said before many times, and I just want to reiterate and recognize that YPS agenda and WPS agenda are complementary to each other. And perhaps some of the parts of my presentations that are coming up will be a little bit simplified. But inclusion is inclusion, right? And when it comes to including different groups within the society into the processes, there is no reason why we cannot learn from good practices within YPS agenda for the implementation of WPS and the other way around. So one of the key common points between the YPS and WPS agenda is the fact that they are both have a dedicated pillar on prevention. And that pillar on prevention is essentially rooted in the need to promote inclusive decision-making. There are numerous studies, research, pathways for peace, policy documents that do recognize that inclusion is and participation is central to prevention. As long as we have inclusive decision-making, prevention will bear fruits. And both agendas do recognize that, you know, in order for prevention to be actually recognized and operationalized in a meaningful way, the efforts to support participation of young people and women in peace processes and any type of peace building conflict prevention work do require adequate financing. So here on the screen, and you by no means required to read the entire thing, and I can share this presentation with anyone who is interested afterwards, but we can see the only language that is currently available on financing for YPS agenda basically in the agreed language by member states. And so we can see a little bit of a trajectory here when the first resolutions on YPS simply call for an increase of political, financial, technical, and logistical support for participation of young people. Then we see a little bit of an improvement of the language in the last resolution on the YPS agenda that calls for accessible resourcing. And that talks about, the challenges that young people traditionally are facing in accessing resources. And last year in September, we have had a little bit of a progress in recognizing the meaningful participation of young people in the design, monitoring, and implementation of peace building efforts, which requires donors to actually consult with young people in the development of their strategies, as well as coordination and collaboration with young people on financing national priorities. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the global commitment on the YPS, on financing the YPS agenda. But I wanted to compare it a little bit with the language on WPS financing. And this is just one paragraph from one resolution. I didn't do a comprehensive overview of the language on financing, but look at how more detailed the language on financing for the WPS agenda is. It includes basically dedicated recognition of the support for civil society. It includes the language on the gender marker. It includes the language on general increase of international development cooperation related to women's empowerment and gender equality. And recently, GPAC has supported, together with the government of France and Dominican Republic, a member state YPS workshop where we discuss with member states, is there a reason why the agreed language on WPS cannot be adapted to the YPS context by the UN Security Council? And the answer was no. There is no reason why, except for the lack of prioritization of the YPS agenda in the Security Council, that language cannot be adapted to the YPS agenda by the Security Council. I want to also unpack a little bit what do we mean when we talk about YPS financing. I think there are three elements there that makes it relevant in terms of advocacy for all member states. And that's where all of us as civil society and UN colleagues can go back to the national governments of donor or non-donor country and basically highlight those responsibilities that are within the agreed language of member states. And those three elements are quality financing, quantity financing, and non-monetary support. In terms of quality financing, that means making the funding more accessible, sustainable, and effective for supporting the work of young people. When it comes to quantity, yes, we always do want to increase of resources, but we also want to make sure that these resources are not only available, but also accessible. And there is also a provision on non-monetary support in the agreed language of member states, which means that we want to make sure that whatever any type of member state, whether donor or not, decide to allocate their national budget towards should include a conversation, consultation, and dedication towards the work of young people. And so some of the key opportunities that we were looking at when it comes to supporting the financing of the YPS agenda, and based on the YPS workshop that we have organized with member states. These are some of the key areas where member states did basically tell us that the progress is possible. And member states of the Security Council and non-Security Council member states agreed that there is nothing really except for political will prevents member states from doing the following. One is commitment at the capital level, because we cannot really succeed at the UN level here in New York unless there is a commitment that comes from the capital level. And that's why the role of every one of us on this call is really important, to go back and advocate with their governments, with our governments, to basically support the implementation of the YPS agenda at the national level, make it a priority, because we do know a lot of member states, big donors, willing to prioritize WPS agenda, making it their focus, coming to every meeting, raising the questions, where are the women, as it used to be, right? But we do not really have this type of member states to raise awareness and to really champion the YPS agenda, except for maybe Finland. So this is something that we all can actually contribute towards making some of the governments of our own countries to be champions of the YPS agenda. The other part is adopting the youth marker. UNDP, UNFPA, and UN Women have developed a common YPS indicator. So this is already a good practice. And we know that Secretary General does work on the development of the youth marker, but this process can be accelerated towards maybe 2024 when the next report of the SG on YPS will be debated. There is a language on fully funded national action plans on women, peace and security. There is no reason why that would not be the same language on fully funded national action plans on YPS. Quality financing is something that member states, donor community, OECD, DAC countries can come together and develop principles on quality financing for YPS agenda. And the last opportunity is, again, as I said, if there is a language on financing for YPS already available, there is no reason why other bodies like ECOSOC, General Assembly, PBC cannot take up this language and actually go to implement it. So with that being said, I guess the point here is that prevention and financing are closely linked. And we do see more and more language coming up on financing for prevention and financing for YPS agenda. But at the end of the day, we do need member states to be able to really champion that in order for a policy action that will follow. Hopefully, stronger implementation will take place. Thanks, everyone. And I'm available if there are any questions.
Thank you, Marina. So now we're going to go into about a 5 or 10 minute Q&A. So if you would like to ask a question to any of the presenters, you can either put your question into the chat or raise your virtual hand. Just make sure that you identify who your question is for. So who would like to go first? And I know there's like over 85 people in this room, so I know we'll have good questions.
Recording in progress.
Any questions? Yes, Lantana.
Okay, thank you everyone and to the presenters. My name is Lantana Baku Abdullahi and I'm from Nigeria. My first question goes to the UN Women speaker or the speaker from UN Women. I was a bit curious in terms of the implementation and ownership of the National Action plans across, many countries. For us in Nigeria, I think we need to also be clear about how UN Women drive this process, sustain this process by ensuring, resource mobilization. In Nigeria, for example, we are one of the, I would say, advanced countries in terms of development of the national action plans. We've had a first generation, we've had a second generation. Unfortunately, since the expiration of our second generation action plan in 2020, we are yet to have another action plan in place. So which leads me to my concerns around how do we ensure sustainability of these processes? Because this huge gap we have, it's a huge disappointment for some of us who are working in this space. And so for me, I think we need to do more in terms of investment and sustainability of these processes. How can we strengthen this? And more importantly, how do we transfer the ownership and the skills required to do this locally so that when we empower local actors, even when UN Women doesn't have funding, the state and local civil society groups can be able to drive this process so that we don't have any gap. And then I also listened to the presentation on the YPS, and somebody was, I think, I can't remember the second or third speaker that was talking about ensuring the linkage between WPS and YPS. Unfortunately, I think this is where I notice a gap. I think in most instances, I've seen that the YPS and WPS are operating in isolation of each other. In rare cases, do we have where we bring these actors together? I can boldly tell you that in most actors do not even, especially working in WPS sector, do not even know or understand what the YPS agenda is all about. So I think we need to also do more to strengthen this gap, to close this gap and make sure that we bring these two key stakeholders working together to advance, their individual, interest. I'm also happy that the presenter talked about the fact that YPS isn't just, it's inclusive. Because in my context, I know that the YPS agenda, we have very strong, capable young people who are doing this, but also getting the required number of female young people to be involved is also another setback that I have seen. What do we do to make sure that we bring young women into the YPS agenda? And I'm happy that it was mentioned that in the WPS, we have this intergenerational link that we've actually adopted, and it's working fine for us. But in terms of inclusivity in the YPS agenda, how do we do it better? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lantana. And I'll take two more just because of time. And I know we have some in the chat. So go ahead, Emmanuel, with your question.
Good morning. My name is Emmanuel. So for me, so I don't know if it will be a question, but kind of appreciation of what has been presented. But I'm wondering if there is any kind of survey that highlights how many civil society organizations are being part of the steering committee in charge of elaborating those national action plans. Because on my understanding, it's like the elaboration of those action plans are not inclusive. So they are being like implementing documents that they were not part of. So they don't know even how it has been drafted, but at the end, they are called to be part of implementers.
So just if I have your question right, it's really about how we are advancing more inclusive efforts within the national action plans. So hopefully I recorded that right. So I'll take one more. Anne Rose, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And I have just one question. It will be interesting to hear from either of the speakers in terms of how, or other best practices towards YPS and WPS financing, now that we already established that there's a lot of duality when it comes to the two kind of frameworks. But also then the other question will be, whose agenda is it? Because the challenge for my context has never been lack of the NAPs, with an exception of the YPS, which is currently being developed at the moment. But it's pretty much more of when this kind of frameworks get to be established, then they are stuck at a certain level. So then which best model can we use to make sure the information goes down? And a best practice will be the action plan on violent extremism, where in as much as civil society organizations are coordinated in terms of reporting and activities that they are doing, but where do we leave the community? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to briefly summarize for our speakers just the questions that were presented. And if you could just keep your remarks short, because we still have the panel that is next. So Leah, I know that there was a question, and this was kind of something that was mentioned throughout all of the questions, which is really when we're promoting the synergies between the W and YPS agendas, how are we promoting and deepening localization in this synergy process? And then for the other speakers, Marina, Shauna, and Erica, really around what I'm hearing in the other questions as well, how are we making the processes of these synergies more inclusive? But also, even if we're not in part of the financing, what are best practices and things that each of us in this room can do to promote the synergies between the two agendas. So first, I'll turn it to Leah.
Thank you, Jessica. Yes, in terms of, I think, kind of several things around the synergizing of the WPS and YPS, but just to answer specifically on how you had framed it, Jessica, in terms of synergizing, it's a question of ensuring that all WPS programming and processes include a specific differentiation that recognizes women not as a homogeneous group, that there's a differentiation in terms of categories, ethnicity, and age, of course, is what we're looking at, but all these different groups and identities that could lead to specific vulnerabilities need to be identified. So those processes need to be there. It is not being done, so that is the work that needs to be done. Now, in terms of YPS, so all the programming on YPS that has developed tend to look at YPS youth, or the word youth, as taking the model of the young men. So there's how the work that needs to happen there is to ensure that there is a recognition of the differential impact of conflict on young men and young women. So all the different discriminatory structural inequalities that exist in society need to be addressed, and therefore a differential strategy for both young women and young men in all this peace building, conflict, specifically conflict analysis. So that's work needs to be done. On the other question, I think the colleague mentioned how NAPs are being implemented and national ownership and the experience of UN women. You may know that, and I'll share that on the chat, there is a WPS focal points network that is, the secretariat is being kept by UN Women, but the initiative itself came out of a group of member states. So those, it was initiated, for example, by Spain and a couple of other member states, Canada, Chile, Japan, Namibia, and the UAE were co-sponsoring this WPS Focal Points Network. There are currently over 100 WPS NAPs that have been adopted. So I hear that Nigeria is very much far advanced. And the question specifically is the financing and national ownership. I have been in DRC just 2 months ago, and I have met with the secretariat of the NAP, National Action Plan. They're on their second generation. They're now developing their third generation. And yes, financing is a huge issue. And that was something that they had placed, for example, on the table during a field visit. And it's a mobilization of resources, but that's what we're trying to ensure, that these processes are also budgeted nationally, that there is sustainability. In terms of further localization, the specific example of DRC, they were developing provincial level, regional provincial level secretariats of the NAP, whereby ensuring that there is participation not only of, for example, civil society organizations, women's civil society from the capital, but also in the regional governmental processes, but also of civil society. And I think the last, again, what I would say in terms of partnerships and also mobilization, one program that I've mentioned before is Generation Equality, the program in UN Women that brings together synergies between the public and private sectors. So that brings a lot of financing as well, not only programming, but financing of joint initiatives. So that is a way forward, is how to bring philanthropies as well together, and it does not, the funding does not need to go to one entity such as a UN organization, but it could really be bilateral partnerships. So I will stop there. Hopefully I've answered some of the questions. Thank you. Over back to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Leah. And then for others who had questions, I mean, feel free to tag the speaker directly in the chat and they can follow up. I've seen Marina very busy in the chat that they can follow up with you directly. So for our other three speakers too, if you want to just briefly, 1 minute, any responses to what's been raised about what people can practically do. Shauna, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you so much, Leah, as well for your comments. I think I would echo a lot of that. I think one thing that I would add is or highlight is really, I think that the importance of localization for all of these processes, for NAP development, for including young women and women. GNWP's flagship localization, the 1325 resolutions, it's our flagship strategy, and it's something that we have also been implementing recently in countries with that have adopted YPS NAPs, and it's really engaging, all key stakeholders from government, security sector, religious and traditional leaders, but especially engaging the local women and the local communities and ensuring that the implementation of YPS and WPS are in their hands. And then something else that I would really add and kind of emphasize from Leah's comments is the importance of ensuring that NAPs and national strategies are budgeted and have the financing. So, for example, costing and budgeting workshops in advance during the development of national action plans. Also, importantly, related to that is ensuring that those workshops and the budgeting and the costing of national action plans and national strategies and local strategies are gender responsive. And so really ensuring that these policies and these coalitions, the development of, the collaborative development of policy is responsive to the unique needs of women and to the unique needs of young women and young people. So, yeah.
Thank you, Shauna. And Erica, I know it's very late.
Yes. I mean, just echoing the Leah and Shauna as well, I'd like to just add, there's been a lot of learning since I work more in the YPS space than the WPS. What we've been really doing is really learning from the WPS in terms of how they were able to work on institutionalization and how they were able to work on their NAPs. At the moment, in the Southeast Asian region, the YPS is really looking at WPS and how they were able to work within the ASEAN region. So I know some of our colleagues is here, like Brian, who was actually one of the conveners for the NAP YPS in the Philippines, which is one of the first in the world that really had a national action plan on youth peace and security. And there's been a lot of learnings from the WPS, but also seeing WPS as kind of an entry point that really paved the way for youth to really put their agenda out there. And so it's not really seen as a competition, but rather the synergies of how we could support each other to make sure that there is that inclusive component to the peace building or the sustaining peace component of the governments or even in communities. And one of the things that was really helpful was really using these tools or these frameworks of the UN Security Council Resolution 2250 or the 1325 and kind of really saying to governments that we do have that kind of framework at the global level, and how do we bring it into our context, and how does peace really relate to young people? And the only way to do that is through partnerships with young people. So it's really young people and different grassroots organizations that's been paving the way in ensuring that these global frameworks translate into the local realities of what's happening on the ground. So yeah, I'm sure there will be more discussions later. Soumya is also here. So those are, I'm not sure who else of the YPS champions are here, but yeah, Soumya and Brian are like one of the best young people that I've worked with in the YPS space, that they could really share more experience in terms of how they really brought it in their own communities. So yeah, back to you, Jessica. Thank you.
And last but not least, Marina.
I don't want to take much time because I'm also excited to learn from Soumya and everyone. So in terms of good practices on YPS financing, I did drop a resource in the chat. share it in. I think there are certainly more, but again, as I said, we have to also be very careful in terms of how different member states donors interpret the YPS agenda. I would be really careful in terms of, taking some of the money from some of the governments who closely associate counterterrorism with YPS, because this is certainly can become an issue. But I just wanted to make a quick point in terms of the national action plans and some of the questions in the chat. I do think that national action plans is something that government should champion. And that's why it's really important for all of us on this call to actually develop a strategy to advocate the national governments to adopt that type of approach and work with governments to make sure that it's adequately funded, right? There are resources the GNWP developed on budgeting the NAPs for the WPS. There is no reason why we couldn't adopt the same strategies for YPS. But there are two ways in which each one of us can decide to work with governments. One is from more of a consultative partnership dialogue approach, and another one is from accountability approach. Both of them work, sometimes a mix of them work. But again, we cannot have a national action plan if we commit to that as civil society. We do have to make sure that the government actually provides support and does have a commitment, because when it happens, then it's more likely to be funded, because donors are likely to give money to the governments when they ask for it rather than civil society. Thanks.
Thank you, Marina. So now we're going to go into our fireside chat. We'll hear from others about how they are advancing synergies in different modality areas such as advocacy, research, and financing. So without further ado, I'll turn it to our facilitator, Wajid Zahid, who is the country ambassador for Peace First.
So thank you, Ms. Jessica. So hi, everyone. I am Wajid Zahid from Pakistan, and nowadays I am based in Bangkok, working as a Young Leader Fellow at Oxfam's in Asia. And I'm also a member of Networks Inclusivity Steering Committee, and I will be facilitating a next panel discussion, which focuses on exploring advocacy, research, and financing synergies between the women peace and security and youth peace and security agendas, as well as ways to strengthen partnerships, and followed by short question and answer session. So moving forward, I would like to provide a brief introduction of each panelist before we proceed with the questions and discussion. So we have three esteemed panelists from diverse backgrounds. Firstly, we have Ms. Soumya Agarwal, the co-founder and CEO of Youth for Peace International. And secondly, we have Ms. Ali Sagdin, the founder of our Generation for Inclusive Peace, and also the technical manager at Agalhas Applied Knowledge. And lastly, we have Ms. Sara, a program analyst at the United Nations of Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. I welcome you all to this amazing panel discussion. So now let's move on the questions. So first, I have a question for Ms. Soumya. So ma'am, we would like to know what advocacy synergies you see between the women peace and security and youth peace and security agendas.
Thank you, Wajid, and hello everyone. I'm really excited to be here today. So to begin with, we have observed in the power structures of India that power and privilege keep young people and women away from the decision-making spaces or overlooked from program designs and implementation. Usually the programs or initiatives that are designed for them, and they are often seen as part of the problem rather than solution. So to give you a little context about India, while more than 50% of the population is under the age of 30 years, there is just one member of parliament currently under 30 years. India has a female population of 662.9 million and is the largest, one of the most resilient parliamentary democracies in the world. Being said, the representation of women both in the upper house and lower house of the parliament is nearly 14%. So the policies and decisions which are directly impact the majority of India's population are discussed and voted on by men with at least a 30-year average age difference. So it's important to question who has the power and privilege, and it remains still with them. So while advocating for YPS implementation, we are seeing in India that a lot of young people are facing threats from government and political leaders. They are being detained just because they are calling this resolution to be political. So therefore, for a country like India, which even neglects to accept the fact that peace building work is needed and important, intersectionality between the two agendas, which is WPS and YPS, can be very helpful to lead the advocacy. In the YPS implementation, stakeholders can address gendered experiences and challenges in YPS work and consider how specific interventions may impact young women, men, and gender non-conforming persons differently. While in the YPS agenda, women who are leading can recognize the marginalization that young women face and how their challenges are different from other women and incorporate their experiences. The YPS agenda has a robust monitoring framework, and many countries have adopted national action plan. So as Erica also mentioned, for people like us who are working in the YPS sector, that is also a learning opportunity, and at least I can say that we are leveraging on it. For instance, when we started the National Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security in India, we reached out to people who are working in the space to learn what are the lessons learned, what are the challenges. For instance, one of them was how we can keep coalition to be youth-led and youth-focused and not have a lot of different stakeholders who then take over the decision-making within the coalition, how they can be allies, how we can have different genders being part of the coalition and also in the convening of the coalition so that their experiences are considered and we can create an inclusive coalition. So my recommendation would be that NGOs, UN entities and member states should prioritize and ensure that not just the quantity, but the quality of the programs can be tracked to see how programs are aligned with YPS and WPS commitments. Secondly, participation of women and young people in setting priorities for peace building financing is still very limited. So how donors can consider ways to increase consultation and involvement of women and young people when deliberating on their peace building priorities or when they are finding ways to finance them, how we can include them, because different contexts have different problems when it comes to financing. So engaging them will give them a way through on how to work in hard to reach communities, because young people have that leverage and advantage. So it can be done in the partnership. For instance, institutions should prioritize incorporating greater civil society, women-led and youth-led organization inputs into the development and implementation of their funding plans and strategies, because we know our challenges better. So engage us in finding solutions for it and not just in implementation. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Ms. Somya, for sharing your amazing experiences and such an important recommendations. They literally can provide an effective practical framework, like particularly for future work while working on WPS and youth, peace and security related areas. So thank you so much. So next I have a question for Ms. Ellie. So ma'am, we would like to know what research synergies you see between the WPS and youth, peace and security agendas. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having OGIP here and for everybody else who's spoken so far. This has been a super interesting discussion. Super happy to be here. If you'll humor me for a second, I'm just going to speak about what OGIP does because it kind of interlinks into my response to this question. So OGIP is a grassroots youth-led organization engaging with the WPS and YPS agendas. And we have 3 pillars in which we do that across. So the first one is advocacy. The main way in which we do that is that we have created an advocates network. We now have 34 youth advocates, although our definition of youth is quite broad. And within that, you do have some advocates up to the age of 35. And we advocate for them to be involved in core multilateral discussions about peace building agendas and make sure they feel supported to contribute and are given access to that space. The majority of them are from conflict zones, so are not just bringing an academic perspective to these discussions, but are able to give real lived experience and contributions. The second pillar we have is the research pillar, and then I'll circle back to answering your question in a second. And we set up the research pillar because we recognized that within the peace building space, so this applies to both the WPS and the YPS agendas, academia and the academia literature around and research around peace building is entrenched in a lot of the power structures that we've all been talking about trying to deconstruct today. So we wanted to produce research that wasn't held to the high rigorous standards that lots of peace building research has typically been held to. And therefore, we have lots of spoken word, lots of poetry, a huge variety of research by a huge variety of different contributors. So we're trying to get a different type of research by a different type of person out there into the collective conversation. And then our final pillar is partnerships. And we did that because we recognized that we had loads to learn from organizations and grassroots feminist collectives who are engaging mainly in the WPS agenda. And we had a lot to learn from them as we try and engage in the YPS agenda. But equally, we felt like we were being super intentional about how we've designed OGIP to be intersectional throughout all of its approaches. And we think that we have a lot to share as well. So we've been trying to bridge that gap continuously. And, interestingly, in our engagement with lots of YPS organizations, we face some of the barriers that we face with other bigger power structures in the system, such as being siloed to be only talked about youth issues with when we're chatting with them, not being given a lot of time or notice when we're engaging in partnership discussions with them. All of us work alongside our day jobs, and as do many youth advocates organizations working in peace building. Therefore, extra lead up time is just crucial for us. And also a lack of remuneration as well when we've been contributing within their discussions. And I think we've spoken, so I think someone asked a question earlier about engagement, and I just think equity and engagement is a super important topic as well. To finally answer your question though on how synergies between research and both agendas. So I think both agendas face similar problems in the research realm, which is exclusive language, identity silos. So women typically only being engaged in the YPS agenda instead of bringing their expertise to the peace building sector more broadly. Same with youth, not being involved in the broader conversations around peace building, and then elite spaces that are harder and have blocks of barriers for women and youth to be involved in. So just to talk about how OGIP has tried to overcome those, we have recognized that a huge way, one of the core foundations of what being intersectional means to us is that we transfer the editing process and any decisions that are made on our research pieces to our community at large. Our community consists of our partner organizations. So there are some organizations there who are only engaging with the WPS agenda and some with the YPS agenda as well. And then we also set up a research group that consists of many of our youth advocates. So they're global, they're based from around the world. They all have different levels of English and different understanding of editing styles. And not only do they choose every research topic we do, and we make sure that those research topics aren't just about WPS or YPS agendas, they're about peace building more broadly. They decide everything that is the topic. So recently we did a research piece on power politics and people on the move. The one before that was the feminist rebuilding, when we hoped that the world would become better after COVID-19. So all those decisions are outsourced to our wider community. And then they also control all of the editing process as well. So we've tried to basically spread the power out wide around our community who engage with both the WPS and YPS agendas.
So thank you so much for discussing these amazing points. And they emphasize the need for focused work in the important areas that you have just mentioned. So moving forward now, I have a question for Ms. Sara. So ma'am, could you please share your insights on what financing synergies do you see between the WPS and YPS agendas? Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Wajid, and thank you everyone for being here, and Jessica for inviting us to this session. I'm speaking on behalf of the United Nations Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund. And we think the first step to ensuring financing synergies between both agenda is recognizing that without the full participation of women in all their diversities, including young women as peace agents, the implementation of both the Women Peace and Youth Peace and Security agenda cannot be fully achieved. The WPHF traditionally works alongside local women civil society organizations, and we often observe recurrent challenges to their access to funding opportunities. They highlighted lack of easily accessible, quality, flexible funding opportunities, a lack of institutional resources allocated to build their organizational capacities, but also a lack of resources allocated to the protection of civil society activists working on peace, security, humanitarian action, and human rights in conflict and crisis-affected countries. And now, being more present in the youth peace and security discussions, we quickly realized that the challenges for youth organizations working on the youth peace and security agenda were the same as those described by local women's organizations. So by responding to the challenges highlighted by local women's organizations, we increased, in a way, our accessibility to youth-led organization or organization focused on the youth peace and security agenda. And in this sense, the WPHF has simplified its application forms and now provides additional guidance through tip sheets and information session on how you can apply to the WPHF funding opportunity. We also allowed civil society organizations to apply for funding as a consortium, with registrations only required for the lead organization and with no minimum period during which the organization must be registered. We also allowed application for smaller grants because we noticed that sometimes there is a self-censorship where youth organizations might not apply because they feel like the call for proposal will be too competitive due to the high budget amount. And as a result, since its inception in 2016, the WPHF supported 72 youth-focused or youth-led organizations, civil society organization, either as a lead on a project or as a co-implementing partner. In 2022, we supported 18 organizations, and 43 of these organizations were first-time recipients of UN funding ever. We also launched an institutional funding stream dedicated to covering the costs, the core costs of civil society organization. And this is a fund that they can use to build their capacity to pay for salaries, especially when we know that most youth organizations operate with voluntary staff. And in 2020-22, 4 civil society organizations benefited from this kind of support to be able to build their capacities and sustain their activities. We also established a specific funding window to promote the protection of women human rights defenders. And with this stream, we noticed that 29% of the women that benefited from the support are actually young women aged between 18 and 29 years old. We also provide through our Learning Hub opportunities for online and in-person capacity sharing and intergenerational dialogue opportunities between young people-led organizations and more established women's organizations working in conflict and crisis-affected contexts. However, we as the WPHF are aware that we need to go to the youth organizations, and we need to be more intentional on our work with young people's organization. And this is why in our 2023-2025 strategic plan, we included the youth peace and security agenda as a cost-cutting area. And in the next 2 years, we hope to increase our engagement with youth-led civil society organizations working across the 2 agenda, but also disseminating more information around opportunities available to young women-led organization or youth-led organization and youth-focused organization. We also are looking to strengthen our reporting and the documentation of young women-led organization and youth-focused organization that we support and the different works they do around peace building, human rights, and humanitarian action. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing such invaluable insights and about impactful work that your organization is doing. It's really amazing. So I just have a final question for you, ma'am. So which is, how can we strengthen partnerships overall between WPS and YPS agendas? Yeah.
I think as a funder, for us, the key point is to avoid working in silos and to be as flexible as we can in what we understand as the Youth Peace and Security Agenda and the Women Peace and Security Agenda, and specifically the manifestations of the synergies between both in practice. We need to support civil society organizations working on both agendas, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes even without openly naming that they're working on both agenda on the same time. And I think we must all understand that in reality, organizations never work on a single United Nations agenda alone, or the Youth Peace and Security Agenda alone, or the Women Peace and Security Agenda alone. Most of the time, they work on a lot of issues at the same time. And as a funder, we need to be as flexible, as understanding as possible of that.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Ms. Sarah, for mentioning such a great points. And I believe that by following this approach or ways, you have described we can establish strong partnerships and collaborations between the WPS and YPS agendas. So unfortunately, we are unable to take any question because we are running out of our time. So moving forward, thank you so much to all our panelists for taking the time to join us and for such a meaningful and productive discussion. So now moving forward, we will have a panel. We have a breakout discussion. So over to Ma'am Jessica. Yes.
Thank you, Wajid. So yes, so now we want to hear from everybody else in the room with some breakout room questions. So if you do have questions for the panelists, please do put in the chat. They can follow up directly. You will have a already chosen facilitator and note taker in the room, and then we will come out and do a readout of the discussions. All right, everyone, welcome back. I hope you had fruitful discussions. I know some people got cut off from the group, but we're going to do a quick readout. So group one, Halima and Tris.
Thank you so much, Halima and Jessica. And yes, we did have a really, really interesting conversation. I think I feel like we've always been in spaces between it's just YPS or WPS. So good to hear how both can be connected together. So going to the first question, our conversation led to kind of really emphasizing that both agendas can have opportunities to learn from each other in terms of what practices are best between each other, and learning how not only just best practices, but what challenges that we can pull, that we can work together to develop other best practices from the challenges. And another group member mentioned that there could be potential opportunities for enhanced collaboration by bringing both agendas together to foster the collaboration to create more comprehensive approaches to advocacy and programming activities. And then working together with both YPS and WPS by combining international intersectional analysis that enables more comprehensive research on conflict dynamics between the two. For the second question, a group member, Hussein, actually emphasized that there's a challenge of lack of understanding between each other. So by knowing how the synergies are available or how to approach each other, that's been a challenge. And they also see there's a sort of a great disconnect between practitioners and policymakers. So when there's a lack of understanding, it's difficult to create effective policies. And that was all that we had time to discuss. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Tris. Group two, Alva and Sarah.
Yeah, so basically there was an interesting discussion on making collaborations between actors of WPS and YPS agendas. And we heard about Bangladesh perspective, that as one of the participants mentioned that the YPS and WPS is quite new in Bangladesh, like which makes difficult to do advocacy because of lack of understanding among stakeholders and also lack of funding mechanism by the government sides regarding implementing YPS on WPS agenda, or not any type of action plans in terms of implementing these agendas. Apart from this, we also discussed solutions. Like one of the participants mentioned that to address this, like CSOs can work with media professionals and can work with government and by using traditional sources of information as well, such as radio broadcast, like sensitization on YPS and WPS side by side, and by making synergies between them, as well as also engaging young people in terms of implementing these agendas, like including like promoting interfaith harmony as well side by side with these agendas. So apart from this, also there was a discussion on changing power dynamics from older generation to young women and young people in terms of working on peace building and countering violent extremism by making a synergies or partnerships between WPS or YPS agendas, and also by engaging young men will definitely has an impact on young women and girls. Apart from this, like engaging older generations in terms of implementing these agendas. So apart from this, there was also a discussion on challenges that particularly women face while working on peace building or while working on implementing WPS agenda and youth peace security agenda. Is mainly discrimination due to prevailing patriarchal culture, and also there is a challenge of lack of political will when it comes to working on YPS and WPS agendas. Yeah, so over to Ms. Soumya if she has something to share. Yeah.
No, I think you have covered mostly. Thank you for sharing. Yeah.
Thank you. That was group 3. Let me go back to group 2. Alva and Sarah. No worries. You wanted to speak. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. We had a really good conversation, and we actually started with the challenges first and then moved to the opportunities. So multiple members brought up the challenges that young women face specifically within both YPS and WPS as women grow older, and in some communities they gain more respect, and so the focus should remain on younger women. We also had another member bring up transgender voices and their rights, specifically in respect to facing religious misinterpretations and how those movements have silenced some transgender folks as well. So the main challenges that we took away was that the lack of understanding and funding problems within this work. And so part of it is convincing governments to include youth in the conversations when some are actively trying to block young women's voices from being heard. So that's one of the main challenges that we discussed within our group. Moving on to the opportunities that we discussed, part of the challenges that we discussed moving into the opportunities was the bureaucracy and the funding. So whether you're facing grassroots organizations that are primarily youth-run, how they face these bureaucracies when they don't have the experience per se. So one opportunity for solutions that one of the members brought up was mentorship organizations from, say, large organizations and even global leaders, and how that can influence, or how national and grassroots focuses should influence global activities. That is my main takeaways, but if you want to bring in anything that I missed.
No, thank you so much. That was an excellent overview. I think in addition, the last thing that could be added was this idea of really more coordinated and efficient advocacy by supplying certain talking points to different actors and to governments, where really we link these two agendas to bring it to the attention of all these opportunities for really higher level advocacy and synergies. I think. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thanks, group 2. And I know Ramatu and I were in the final group, and I know we're close to time, so I'll just briefly highlight a couple of things that were raised, and it's been kind of raised in the other groups as well, which is around thinking about how we address joint gaps together. So identifying where, for example, if there is a WPS or YPS agenda or not, working and co-creating together to make sure that those staples are there for each country, looking at the opportunities at the country and local level to do that. And making sure that we find ways to connect the two spaces. And we actually identified this through our conversations around challenges. So thinking, for example, if we have the issue of the fact that we have shared donors and there's competition of funding, having donor requirements that actually say, whether it's for WPS or YPS, that there is youth integration, that there is gender integration into both sides. Thinking about intersectionality as connectors. We both spaces really need to deepen our understanding more broadly. So that's a way that we can connect and deepen. And looking at how we overcome, those structural and institutional barriers together. And maybe that's thinking again about quotas, making sure that within our own programs that we have both those lenses and connections and partnerships in our work together. So it's that whole leave no one behind and making sure that everyone is together in the same boat. So that's just briefly group 4. Just to quickly close out in thinking about, this is our 3rd community of practice meeting. We will have one more. So it'll be a little bit before we see each other again. The final meeting will be on Monday, December 4th, same time, and it'll focus on promoting the inclusion of persons with disabilities within peace building efforts right around the International Day for Persons with Disabilities. So that will be the final meeting of the year. We will also have the 16 days campaign on the elimination of violence against women that we will do in November. So stay tuned to see how you could also be involved in that. So if you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll be sending out all of the communication materials and follow-ups from this meeting and the recording. So thanks to everyone for a really fruitful meeting. And thanks to our speakers for their really brilliant inputs.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Thank you, each one.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a nice day.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Trace, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you, Jessica.
Resource person. Bye.
Hi, Jessica. I came late. I'm very much sorry. I was in a meeting.
No worries.
I hope I can get the recording and listen
Yes,
from
we'll
there.
be sharing the recording of the event for sure.
Thank you very much. And
Thank
if
you.
I can get the email address, I will keep in touch with you. I will appreciate it. Thank you very much, Jessica.
Thank you.
Thank you.